Um, so let me just share my screen. You see some slides.
Looking good.
Yep. Okay, cool. Yeah, so as Rich mentioned, this is something that I've been working on for a while. I first showed it. That blog post you mentioned, which I'm going to talk about briefly in the talk, came out of a attempted SciPy Lightning talk, which we didn't get, but writing the Lightning talk became the blog post. But I've been working on this for a while, and it's now sort of getting to the point where it's a bit more mature. So like I want people to try it out. And this is a talk I gave at AMS a few weeks ago, basically the same talk, so should hopefully be well within time. So yeah, I'm going to talk about this data tree thing for Xarray and how you can potentially use it. So just for some context, I'm currently working as an oceanographer at Columbia, but before that, I was a plasma physicist. So I've had to deal with these like turbulent data sets in these two different fields of science. During that time, during my PhD, when I did the plasma stuff, I got into Xarray and then sort of transitioned across fields using Pangeo as a bridge, which is why I'm quite enthusiastic about tools that can be used across multiple different fields of science where possible. So like I was attracted to the Datatree project partly because it's like very sort of general like data structure problem that has many different potential uses, that there's nothing specifically to do with geoscience. So in this talk, I want to motivate Datatree partly through what I'm going to describe as a problem of data complexity. Then I'm going to talk about what Datatree does specifically, like how it's built, what features it has, and how it might be helpful for dealing with that problem of complexity. And then I'm going to show a few motivating examples of people who've tried it out already and the kind of things that they've tried to use it for. So the complexity of big data. So obviously, like literally part of Pangeo's mission statement is to deal with big data in geosciences. But that involves multiple like specific challenges, one of which is like scalability, which is why we like based on Dask or other distributed frameworks, and why we've got like parallel reads and writes, Zarr and so on. And again, storage and archiving. So like we use file formats and cloud storage for that. But one thing we don't talk about so much is just like the mental load of dealing with like large amounts of not just a single large array, but like many, many different arrays that each have their own metadata or each have their own meaning, and you're trying to use them all together. But big science can mean that rather than just like exactly the same analysis, but bigger dimensions. So to give you a concrete example of this, CMIP has become huge. There's literally a Twitter like argument going on right now about whether or not CMIP 7 is just going to be like unusably bloated. And the problem is that even for CMIP 6, so this is using, I think, intake ESM to look at, you're basically querying a database for model runs that match specific criteria, like specific variables and specific scenarios. And even if you make quite a specific query, you still get hundreds and hundreds of different runs back. And this is like this is pretty difficult to keep track of if you want to do science that takes statistics over many of these models. So this is one example of like complexity with big data. And science has lots and lots of examples like this. So every time we have data at multiple different resolutions, every time we have simulations or experiments that are heavily parameterized. So CMIP is one example, but there are lots of others. When we have heterogeneous data, so a simple example is if you have a simulation of a system and you also have an observation of the system, then your data is related and you want to treat it together, but it's not identical and it doesn't necessarily like line up very easily. And also another use case for data tree motivation is anytime your netCDF or Zarr file has multiple groups, you've automatically got like a much more complicated set of data to be dealing with. So I'm sure everybody here is familiar with Xarray, but the main thing I want to draw you to in this slide is that an Xarray data set, which is the whole thing in this image here, multiple variables, multiple coordinates, is an in-memory representation of a single netCDF group. And I've not said netCDF file for a reason. It's a single group. But if you're a regular user of Xarray, you might find yourself using this particular pattern over and over again, where you use many separate dataset objects, because the dataset object looks quite general, but it does have restrictions. And sometimes those restrictions mean you need quite a few different dataset object instances. So if you found yourself writing code that's loops over a dict of datasets and then applies the same operation to each one, for example, or maybe you've got like one data set for your observations and one data set for your simulation or your reanalysis. Like this is redundancy. Like this doesn't need to be happening. But the issue is ultimately caused by the fact that these real use cases mean that you're dealing with data, and your analysis workflow involves data that is too complicated to fit into a single object. And so one of the motivations for the Datatree object is to see whether we can simplify use cases like this and banish this sort of anti-pattern of iterating over a simple container of multiple dataset objects and do something cleverer. So enter Datatree. So what is it? It's a hierarchical tree of Xarray data sets. So it's deliberately copying the Xarray dataset model, but making a hopefully relatively intuitive generalization of it. So this is a single data set, but this is old hat. Instead, imagine many data sets all grouped in a tree recursively, where the entire tree is known as a data tree, but any subpart of the tree, any subtree, is also a data tree object. And then at each node, you can store the entire contents of an Xarray data set. So you can think of it like a nested dictionary of data sets. You could think of it like a file system of data sets. But there's a lot more that you can do with this. And the data set analogy is like, we've tried very hard to keep that, like, that's not exactly how it works under the hood, but it's deliberately made in such a way that if you think of it like that, it should hopefully behave intuitively for you. And so an example of why you might want to do this, so one of the motivating examples for the data tree, someone suggested that they would like to be able to organize their data something like this. And I think this is a really nice, like, motivating, like, aspirational case here, where you have a single tree that's split up into different types of data that are related or lie on the same, well, planet in this case. But then each can be further broken down. So you've got different types of temperature, different physical variables. You have satellite data that's in different bands, but the bands are related. And then maybe you have something totally heterogeneous, but still lies on the same planets, for example, population data. So Datatree so far, what are the features that exist? So one of the main ones is I/O. So you can open any netCDF file or Zarr store containing multiple groups as a nested tree, and you can save them back out and basically round trip them. So for example, we can use the open data tree function on a netCDF file. And then even though it contains many, many groups, in this case, I deliberately got the most disgusting example I could get from some friends who still work in plasma physics. And this one has like 40 groups or something, and it's heavily nested, but Datatree just happily opens the whole thing. Another feature is that when if that printable tree representation is like too much to handle, then we have this nice interactive HTML representation instead, where by default in Jupyter Notebooks, then you get this HTML wrapper where you can just click to open all these groups, which correspond to like levels of the tree. So you can see each node as you go deeper and deeper. And then within each node, it's basically just showing you the HTML, the normal Xarray HTML wrapper of a data set. The tree provides relationships. It's built of relationships between the nodes, and there's lots of convenience functions to try and make it easier for you to see how the nodes are related to each other, and iterate over them. So the different groups are connected as a parent-children model. So each node has one parent, or if it's the root node of the tree, it has no parent, but each node can have arbitrary many children, which means that like a family tree analogy gets you fairly far because it's quite obvious what a sibling is. It's the parents' children, parents' other children, and what the ancestors are. It's the parents of the parents of the parents going back all the way to the root. So to explain it, let's take a famous family tree. And we can build an example, and we imagine we've built a tree where we have a node Homer, and Homer has some children, and we can assign him some children, and they're stored in a dict-like manner under their names. And then he forms part of this tree. We've also given him a parent, Abe. So Homer Simpson, you can see, but clearly you can see that Homer Simpson has 3 child nodes. He has a parent node, and in one particular episode, he has a long-lost brother. So that would be, so Herbert Simpson would be a sibling of Homer Simpson in this tree. And you can navigate through this tree through the attributes and properties, like .parent behaves intuitively. So we go from the Maggie node, .parent gets us to Homer, and then Homer has a name. And that's one way to think about the tree. Another way to think about the tree is through a file path like analogy instead. So a file path, like a Unix file tree, is also a tree in the mathematical sense. And so you have a privileged root node, which doesn't have a name, but then every subdirectory below that has a name. Each subdirectory can only have one parent directory, but each subdirectory can have arbitrarily many subdirectories within it. So we're also deliberately exploiting the analogy to a file system here. And there are various syntaxes that the tree supports where you can do things like a get item with a // to move up the tree. You can ask what the relative path between nodes of the tree is, and so on. And then finally, in the most recent version, I made it so you can also access nodes via attributes. So if you want to, you can start at the top of the tree, you can do dot, and then like it supports tab autocomplete. So you could do dot, see what all the immediate children are, complete it, dot again, and then just keep that going down and down until you get to the specific like leaf node that you want, for example. Another feature of the tree, so far we've not really talked about actually doing any computation with the tree. So far we've only really talked about using it as like an organizational data structure, and maybe you don't even like, it's already useful without doing any computation, like just for organizing, because you can just pull out the data sets if you need them. But if you want to, you can use it as a high-level structure to map lots of operations over the tree as well. So the way that we do this is we basically just duplicate Xarray's normal computation methods on the tree object. And then when they're called, then they automatically map over every node in the entire tree below. So if you imagine I have a tree that contains many, many CMIP ensemble members that each is like over time, but their actual time coordinates are completely different. Maybe some of them are historical runs and some of them are future runs. So they can't be aligned, which is why they're not in the same data set. But you can put them in different nodes in the tree. If you still want to take the mean of the whole lot, you can just do .mean, and this will basically just propagate. This will just call .mean on the data set in every node with the same arguments, dim equals time in every case. So as long as every data set below has a dimension called time, then this operation will execute. As well as providing the default, like the normal Xarray API, then we can also map custom computation over the tree as well. So if I have a more particular type of mean I want to perform, in this case, just over like X and Y, like latitude and longitude or whatever, I can map that arbitrary operation over the whole tree as well. So now on to some example use cases. So the first one is the CMIP data, which I've mentioned a few times already. And Rich mentioned the blog post. So Julius Busecki and I tried to use the trees to do a multi-scenario, multi-model analysis. And you can read the blog post about that. But Julius also gave a talk at AMS with an upgraded version as well. And we're still, this is what the blog post title is, but we're still actively working on this. And we want to, the next step is to like see if we can analyze like the whole lot with Dask basically. And yeah, we want to reproduce the same sort of ocean SST temperature data set, but try and sort of push it a bit further soon. So the start of the tree might look something like this, where at one level you've got the particular GCM model that was used for that run, and then it's broken down further by the scenario or the baseline. And then what you can do is, with a relatively small number of lines of code, you can get to plots that intrinsically require you to iterate over and compare between many different models, even if those models are from different GCMs and they have different resolutions and different time coordinates or different scenarios and so on, but you can still plot them against each other. So the idea was to make multi-model analysis easier to do. A second completely different example that someone's been playing with is these ocean gliders. So this is an ocean glider. It's basically like an autonomous drone with various sensors on it for taking readings about the ocean. And Guilherme Casal from Scripps came to me because he wanted to see if he could put ocean glider datasets into the tree. And the reason why he thought the tree would be a good fit is because each glider drone has multiple sensors, and those sensors, some of those sensors work only when you're deep in the water, and some of them only work when you're at the surface, like for example, GPS. So the sensors are never going to have a consistent time base because they can't. Like some of them will be recording when you're underwater and some of them will be recording at the surface. So those will never match up, which means you can't easily put them into one data set with a common time coordinate, but you could put them into a single tree where you have a dimension called time, but the actual values of the time coordinate are different. So in this case, he's just put the CTD and the GPS in different nodes of the tree. So it's quite a different use case. A third example is multi-resolution data. So data where like everything else is the same, except that the grid that the data is lying on is of different resolutions. So this comes up if you're doing, if you have a simulation and you're running it at multiple resolutions to see if it's converged. That's like an obvious time when you want to directly compare the results of three things that are the same, except that their grid resolution is different. But also the Carbon Plan folks and Joe Hammond used this to make this really nice part of the backend for this really nice interactive viewer. And what you should be looking at here is this web-based JavaScript viewer is that the resolution of the coastlines changes while you zoom in. And that's because what's happening is that there's a Zarr store underlying this, which is being accessed through the tree, and the tree is just a convenient way to pull out different resolutions, and each different resolution is being stored as a different node in the tree. So it just forms a convenient way to pull out just the parts that you want. So as you zoom in, only then do you pull out the higher resolution data for that specific region. So another example that I've seen people use it before, I'm not sure how far Alex got with this, but it's an interesting use case anyway, which is basically the idea that if you're trying to analyze forecast model runs into the future, then they intrinsically have different time coordinates because they have different lead times, which again is like an unalignable coordinate. But what you could do is you could put those different lead times into different nodes in a tree. And then finally, Max Grover and the Xradar people have got a similar problem where they have atmospheric radar that does sweeps, and each sweep might point at a different like azimuthal, like angular elevation, which might mean that the number of the coordinate of that sweep is going to be different, but they might end up with a different number of points as they change the angle. I mean, correct me if this is wrong, Max, but they've been early adopters and have made some data tree returning functions that can open their funny group files and stuff, and return it as a tree-like object where they put different sweeps as different groups in the tree. So future plans. So one thing we're doing right now is the long-term plan is to integrate this object upstream into Xarray. And hopefully in the next version of Xarray, then you should be able to just do this instead of bothering with the separate package that Datatree currently lives in. Another thing I want to do in future is see if we can come up with a sensible way to do automatic tree broadcasting of operations. So let's imagine you have a tree with a bunch of data in it, and you want to multiply it by another tree that has a bunch of data in it, but the second tree doesn't have the same number of children and nodes and so on. In some cases, that operation does kind of still make sense. And so I've been trying to come up with rules for when that operation does make sense. And it's an interesting algorithmic problem that's kind of similar to array broadcasting, but a different problem. So if that sounds interesting to you, then there's issues to read about that on the Datatree repository. And it might involve coming up with sub-functions, or imagining doing that in terms of individual operations, like taking the union of two trees before you map operations over the results, for example. But in general, it's at a stage where I really want other people's ideas and feedback. There's quite a lot of like low-hanging fruit, so to speak, that's not been made. Like I've concentrated on making something that's general and like provides functions and methods and so on to allow you to like easily iterate over things and build things and so on. But there's lots of like obviously useful, quick to write methods where the implementation may only be a couple of lines of code that have not yet been implemented, just because like that's not been a priority. So if you use the tree and you're like, oh, I wish I had the ability to just like merge the leaves of the tree together in a single line, in single call or something like that, then that's the kind of thing I want to know about, because then we can just like stick it in and it'll be useful to people. So there's the repository where it currently lives and where all the discussion is, and there's a QR code pointing to it. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. That was great, Tom. That's super clear and super. I have this